So I realized recently that it's been a couple of years doing this here world building video series, and that's after a few years of doing the books. And I realized that the one thing we never actually got to was probably the first thing she started with, and that is, what is world building? What is its definition, and how does it pertain to fantasy specifically, and to science fiction, and all the other genres as well? And like most things here, it's a very easy, short answer, but then a long time taken to unpack it. Just kind of like this whole channel and world building in general. So I hope you stick around. My name is Matt, and once every so often I break down world building techniques, tricks, and tips. And we're getting back to that today as we look at world building, how it pertains to science fiction and fantasy, and the two paradoxes that come with fantasy world building. So yeah, it's been a kind of long hiatus, but I've not been idle. I finished off one series, which I think was my last series of videos, which was a while ago. I've written another one, which is coming out in about a month, it looks like, and I am into the post-it notes section of getting out book 2, which I will probably cover in another video real soon, about how to plot with post-it notes. I've done a video on it before, but this one will be the process as it's happening, because I'm only about there right now. And yeah, I'm going to be at WonderCon in Anaheim in a few weeks, and yeah, new book. So plus some other side projects that are secret at the moment. But anyways, enough of that. Let's look at the reason we're here in the first place, and that is world building. And really easy definition of what world building is in terms of storytelling, and that is an authentic sense of space and time such that a setting feels like it exists independently of the story being told. Yeah, it's more than setting. It is a sense, it is the vibes, it is the feeling of that world being real. And even though it's there for the story, anyway, it feels like the world began before the story, will go on after the story, and there are parts of the world that are unexplored still in the story. That's a sense of completeness. That's one of the 4 C's of world building, which is another story for another time. But anyways, like I said, authentic sense of space and time, such that the setting feels that it exists independently of the story being told. Which leads us into the first paradox of fantasy world building, is that it feels like the world is independent of the story, but you design the world to tell the story. You can world build without a story, but you can't have a story without a world. So you can build a world for just your own edification, fun, but to tell a story, you need a world, you need a setting, and that kind of thing. So that's the funny part about world building. Good world building is that it feels independent of the story, even though it is entirely dependent on the story, or the story is entirely dependent on it. You need a world for the story. That's why the world is there. So yeah, is really important in fantasy genre, which we'll get to in just a second, but it is not mutually exclusive to fantasy. Good world building is that sense of time and space, an authentic sense of time and space, and has been around in pretty much any genre whatsoever. I was watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and that's one of the things that bring up, like cop shows, that sense of authenticity of the world that the cops inhabit, and it's not just to the setting kind of thing. Stephen King's Derry, Maine, a lot of his stories take place there. It doesn't really exist. The Simpsons, they have Springfield, which I meant to grab one of my little things from The Simpsons when I went to the Universal Studio and went to Simpsons Land, where they actually build the world of The Simpsons, which is a comedy show and that kind of thing. So world building, Springfield, it doesn't feel real, but it is a sense of time and space that is authentic to the story and is a part of the story, and you feel at home in the story and that kind of thing. You can look at it and go, that's Springfield, or that's not, that doesn't make sense, that didn't feel like a real cop setting in that thing. That Western was really anachronistic because it didn't feel like it lived up to the authentic time and space that the story was taking place in. And so, like I said, it's a part of all genres, but it's kind of a bonus to them. Like if you are reading a horror story and I really got a sense of 1980s skate punk, setting and the milieu and all that, great if it adds to the story, but you can tell a story without it. Kind of thing. Oh, that drama, that romance, that kind of thing. Do you really need the setting for that? No. I mean, if it's there, even better. Awesome. Thing is, for fantasy and science fiction, it's required. World building is necessary for those. It is one of the core concepts of it, or core components of it, I should say. And that all kind of comes down to genre expectations. And I'm not going to go into this. I spent some time in the first chapter of the book going into it. But this is publishing terms. There's literary, upmarket, and genre. Hopefully I have my nice little infographic up there. And just very, very quick Cliff Notes version of it. Literary are the stories that are really great about prose. They want to win awards on how beautiful the language is, and that's who they are writing to, people who care about prose over story and character. Upmarket is all about the experiences of the characters and the audience themselves. It's the experience, so more characters, and it's kind of in between genre and literary. These are your Oprah book clubs, that kind of thing, where you want to sit and talk about it and how they felt about it. I have my own issues with upmarket, but anyways, yes, then there's genre, which we write in, which is all the genres: thriller, horror, romance, science fiction, etc., historical fiction. And those focus on the plot traditionally of something is accomplished, this thing happened. It's all about moving the story along in genre. And, a perfect book will have great prose, will have great characters with great experiences, and have a wonderful plot. But each of those in the industry focus on a specific thing. I would also maintain that all genre books have genre expectations, and that is, what you're going into the genre for. Usually eponymous. Thriller, is it thrilling? Horror, is it to make a sense of fear? Romance, did you feel romantic? Was it about the relationships, kind of thing? These are the genre expectations. And for science fiction and fantasy, they are breaking the laws of nature. Basically, you are going into science fiction and fantasy to experience something that does not exist either yet, as in the science fiction, or just impossible to exist, like dragons and magic in our real world. Those are the hallmarks of those two genres. Those are the things you are going into it as an audience member, and therefore those are the things the author must bring to the table for you to enjoy it. This is your fantasy expectation. Again, breaking the laws of nature, which is our second paradox of fantasy world building, in that, it's all about creating the authentic sense of time and space. But that thing can't exist. There are no dragons, but we're going to write a story that feels like the dragons are real, and you're going to want to go to this world because of the real dragons or the real magic school or all these other things that are really cool that we want to exist in our real world, but they're not there. But at the same time, we need to make them feel real. Paradox number 2, the hard part of fantasy writing in general. So the question then becomes, how do you do this thing? How do you create this sense of authenticity to something that doesn't exist? But before we get into that, I guess we should actually look at the caveats of other genres that use world building or unreality as genre expectation. Historical fiction is a story of, it takes place in a time, and the world building is going to be necessary for that. If you write a Regency romance that says dude and bro and such all the time, it doesn't take place in 1980s California, then, people are going to say, that really broke the immersion for me. That world building was bad. If you're doing historical fiction, then the world building, the sense of time and place, is necessary for it. Horror, on the other hand, is very similar in that it is breaking reality as we know it. We are creating ghosts and demons and monsters and psychics and that kind of thing. But unlike fantasy, where the creating the sense of wonder or awe by breaking reality, horror creates a sense of terror or horror in the audience. That's the goal of it, to give you that little dopamine pop when you get frightened about things. Science fiction, fantasy, alternate realities, and I'm totally alternate histories, that's the thing. Another sort of thing where it's all about getting that time and place and then extrapolating differently, breaking the laws of nature as we know that, or the laws of history, I guess, if you put it that way. But back to the original question, how do you do good world building? I discussed this in, I think, another video. I don't know if I actually have. If it's linked, if it is, and if not, another chapter of I don't like using the terms good and bad world building. I like using effective and ineffective, and then I also use exemplars like Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and Avatar: Last Airbender, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, as exemplars of things that show very, very effective world building, that are so much so that they inspire theme parks and that kind of thing. But to do good world building in the traditional sense, and what everyone really wants to know is how to do good world. I really think boils down to two things. You either have to adhere to the details, or you have to have author authority. And adherence to details is getting all the things right in that time and place. If you're, in fantasy, a lot of times we take from cultures that exist, from time periods that exist, we grab those things. And if we do, we want to keep them accurate. And the historical fiction, again, is all about the accuracy and adhering to the details of that world or the thing that's a part of it. Problem is, adherence to details is very, very difficult because audience expectations. And we talk about this as there's an old programming term called someone always knows more karate. No matter how good you think you're at programming, someone is better at it. Same thing about karate. You think you're the best karate guy. This was in the 70s when karate was cool, but there's always someone who knows more. And as writers, we find that a lot when you research this thing, try to get the details, and then someone contacts you and says, you got that wrong. That really just broke it for me as an audience member. This is what it should have been. And I know many a fantasy author who does not talk much about horses or archery, because those are two groups of people who really want you to get it correctly and will let you know when you don't. For me, one of the moments as someone who makes jewelry, here some of the stuff I need to repair for my wife. Anyways, I do jewelry and metalsmithing, and one of the things that always bugged me in Game of Thrones was when they make Varys, whatever, the terrible brother, his golden crown by melting gold in a pot over the fire. And you can't do that. I know that kind of thing. I know karate in that one, and I know that you can't do that. That threw it off for me. It was still a great scene. It was very well done. It got its theme across, but that was an adherence of detail that was incorrect. Same thing in Game of Thrones, where his Littlefinger's sigil is the mockingbird. Everything else is very Euro grabbed, but the mockingbird is actually North American. And again, a little knowledge of birds and mockingbirds, since I'm from Texas, state bird, we know these kind of things. Anyways, is that important to the story? Not really. Is that a detail that was not adhered to correctly? Yeah, I guess so. And I remember the anecdote in Mad Men. There was a story about the attention to detail was such that a waitress's pad, as she's taking the order, had the actual prices written out authentically to the time, and that kind of thing. And you're wow, that's a lot of effort. Did it add value to the story? Did to the scene? Yes, but how much effort was worth it putting into it versus how much the audience got out of it? And the other thing about, people might not agree, audience expectations. I always think about this, and I remember someone on our message board was complaining about one of Sanderson's stories because the character said, wow. And really? That's what threw you off? Oh, that's, not a medieval word. They shouldn't have used it. And well, if you look up the etymology, wow is a medieval word, and also this is a secondary world that Sanderson wrote. He kind of knows what he's doing, but nope, that throws me out. Even when he brought it up, that throws me out. So that illustrates the point that you can't please everyone all the time. And so then do you aim for the inverse of displeasing the least amount of people, the least amount of time? Again, I think we've been kind of moving past that. And even in historical fiction, that kind of thing, The Great, which is one of my favorite shows, has that, warning at the beginning of some of this is true, occasionally, and Bridgerton, historical fiction, we still got beautiful costumes. You're going to love the scenery, all those things that the world building that most people do, but we're not going to be slavishly adherent to the details themselves of the time period. Which gets us to the second part, which is author authority, and that is knowing your world back and forth. That can also mean doing your own thing, having a vision and then executing it, which is the examples of The Great and Bridgerton. This is what we're going to do, and you're either buying in or you're not, and we are going to 100% do this thing. And that is pretty great, and I enjoy it, and The Great is a good show. You should watch it. But that's also comes across from the author knowing their world, being their authority of it, and executing their vision. But that doesn't mean you include all the details of your world. And we've talked about this before, about the iceberg theory and world building kudzu, and like just heaping all of your information and your details. And long story short, should avoid it. I think I have a video about it, but it is like wanting to talk about anything, your story or something at a party. You know, you have a polite amount of information you can talk about your interests before you go and become crazy. And that is one of the things that it's hard to know as an author and as a person at parties of what all you share and what you don't, and when is oversharing and that kind of thing. But to get author authority, there's really just, in my opinion, two ways to do it, and that is first research. And that goes back to the adherence of details, because one of the things we discussed, fantasy conceits are in world building where you break the laws of nature. You said, this is a thing that happens in my world, there is magic, there are dragons, and that kind of thing. However, there is something called terra de facto, which is the understanding that if it doesn't fall under a fantasy conceit, i.e., there are ghosts in this world, and if something happens in that story that is not affected by the ghosts, then it has to default to the world as we know it, the real world. Tolkien was the first one to point this out, that we rate secondary worlds by how well we understand the primary world, which is our world. So that if it's not a fantasy conceit, it must adhere to the real world, which means you need to know that information for your world, even if it isn't part of your fantasy conceit. So if I'm writing a story about horses, and if I'm writing a story about, let's say, a gunpowder fantasy in the alternative America, horses are basically cars in it, hairy cars in it. I just need to know the bare minimum of horses, that kind of thing, to pass like what I call the Wikipedia threshold of like, yeah, I use the right words. Don't delve into it because it's not really important to the story. However, if I'm writing something like Black Beauty, where I have the horse and breaking the horse, which I actually haven't read Black Beauty in so many years, I don't remember. But anyways, if a horse is central to the story itself, I'm going to have to know more details about horses and riding them and breaking them and taking care of them and that kind of thing. So the more important a detail, even if it's not part of your fantasy conceit, is to the story, the more you need to know it, and you need to know it through research, and then you know it backwards and forwards, or at least you feel safe talking about it. The second part is extrapolation, and that is the knowing your world, the fantasy conceits, all the things about it, its history, deep history, creation myths, everything, and you find that through extrapolating and exploring. You take your ideas, and I've done videos on this about building up and building out, and you take your ideas, you take what you have in your story, you think about it, you think about it, you think at it, you poke holes at it, you explore the idea until it's to its conclusion, and you say, well, for instance, these urban fantasy mystery stories, and we're like, oh yeah, but okay, well, so-and-so wants to hide something, but how do you hide things in a world where magic's real and they can just do a truth spell? Like, oh yeah, I'm really glad I thought about that ahead of time rather than in the story itself, because if people, your audience will poke holes in it. If you have not gone through at least the basic level of poking holes in your own story, your audience is going to be very disappointed when they show up and think, well, what about this? What about this? Well, what about this? Oh, crud. I really should have thought about that ahead of time. So that's a big component of author authority, and that is sitting in your world, knowing it backwards and forwards, and knowing how things could be and how to explain stuff ahead of time. And that's kind of the fun part. I am a top-down designer, and I like to spend a lot of time in my world before I even set, figures to keyboard on it. And so yeah, I'm a big proponent of extrapolation and exploration. So the takeaway is, remember how important world building is to fantasy, and it is a key component. It is, it's a foundation of the genre itself. And so give it the time it deserves and really put in the research and exploration, and I hope it helps you build some better worlds.